Welcome. This is the podcast series dedicated to living a revenue culture. Lots of companies think the most important thing they can do is make a lot of money so that then they can focus on their culture. Revenue science tells us that maximum profits only occur after you've optimized your people. And this podcast is dedicated to spreading the word about how you can optimize your people so that together you maximize your profits. And every 2 weeks, we bring you somebody from the community who's actively working in that space. And today, I'm thrilled to have Lee Benson with us. And Lee's, I think, started 7 companies over the last 25 years. He's had exits from a few million to 9 digits. He's worked with hundreds of leadership teams and companies ranging from 4 people to 40,000 people. And a few weeks ago, one of my clients asked me the question. In revenue science, we use a 5-step process to help optimize your people, minimize your chaos, and maximize your profits. And somebody asked me the question, have you ever seen a company reach the 5th step? And I had to stop and think for a minute. And I said, I think so. And the company I thought had made that step 5 was one of Lee's companies, Able Engineering. So that meant I had to go read his book, which I highly recommend, Your Most Important Number. And then I thought, well, heck, I got to get Lee on the podcast. So Lee, welcome. And I'm dying to share some of the things that are in your book and that you and I've talked about.
Well, Rick, thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to this conversation. I've been looking forward to it for a couple of weeks now.
Well, good. I would, and I know this is a big ask, but tell us about your background and particularly the lessons you learned from Able and your most important number. And then I don't want to not have you talk a little bit about the new venture between the software and the consulting, because if I understand it correctly, you're bringing the lessons you learned to everybody who wants to learn them with you.
Yeah, absolutely. That is a huge question that I could take 3 weeks to answer, but let's go for a really short, pithy version of it. And I like to say, you know what, I got my start pulling weeds for 25 cents an hour back in the late 1960s. And I struggled to get a capability. I used that to build my confidence. I created value from it. And then I thought, wow, what else could I do? And then that went on to shoveling snow. It 4-folded the money I made per hour, then paper routes, and then working in a restaurant, dishwasher, busboy, cook. In the 80s, I played in a rock and roll band over 1,000 nights that decade. And that's how I made most of my money. I don't count it as one of my 7 businesses, but it clearly was. And I couldn't articulate it back then, but I can articulate it now. And this is what really drove all of my success, this value creation sort of struggle cycle where you identify a capability you want, you struggle to develop that capability and build self-confidence, but don't stop there. Use it to actually create value. And then each time you can take bigger and bigger steps. And so by the time I was 20, I learned to trust the struggle. I came from a very low income household. I was kicked out of the house the beginning of my senior year in high school. It was a non-event for me financially because I was already financially independent. It was easy for me to do that and never felt like a victim. Things were great. I felt like I could do anything because I learned to trust the struggle. No matter how hard it got, I would get this feeling inside knowing it's going to be better on the other side, even when it seems terrible right now. So fast forward, early 90s, Able Metallic Services is the first business. Went from 3 employees to over 500, but that was made up of I guess that would have been 4 companies that we bundled together and sold to Textron in 2016. But it was that struggle cycle. Get the capability, build confidence, create value, rinse and repeat. And I know it sounds like a really simple answer to your question, but that's been my success strategy. And I am on my 7th company that I've started from scratch now. And the one you're referring to, Able Engineering, It was the biggest by the number of employees. I also started Able, that was in 95 when I founded that company. I started Able Aerospace in 99. Those are the primary two that I combined, and we sold as Able Aerospace to Textron Aviation, and they're still rocking and rolling today. I love following them on LinkedIn. It's so great.
So, you and I talked a little bit off camera about the concept of value. Tell us what value means to you, and talk a little bit about how you helped instill that in your organizations.
Yeah, value, like a lot of things, it can be seen as something really good, and it can also be seen as something that, you know, can drive the wrong result. And the example I would give you is people will say, when you talk about value, all you care about is money. Well, that's not a holistic approach to creating value. To me, value is created in one of three macro buckets, and usually everybody plays in all three buckets. There's material value, there's emotional energy value, and there's spiritual value. And even though I've had pretty good success materially, you know, in selling companies for a lot of money, so lots of money and things, I believe if I have a strength that rises above all the others in each of those three buckets, it's on the emotional energy side. And so coming in as a leader, I didn't think, oh, I need to energize everybody today. I just passionately wouldn't stop talking about what's possible and getting everyone to engage in productive conversations and how we're actually going to get there. And that's pretty infectious to be able to do that. So I think about value creation holistically, and it's for every stakeholder. It's for you. You talk about it, Rick. It's for all of our team members. They need to do well. It's our customers. It's the investors, shareholders, et cetera. Our suppliers, supply chain. Everybody needs to win together. And I think about value creation as win-win. It can't be win-lose. When you think win-lose, losers won't hang out long, and they don't, you know, you can't sustain that. But win-win, we can sustain literally forever. So that's how I think about value creation, and it really solves for the problem of profit having a sort of a negative vibe around it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. And it's interesting when in the work I traditionally do, I try and help clients work with their client to preview. We use the term monetized value, but so much of the monetized value is emotional or personal, or, you know, it's the experience of being successful. It's not just the fact, yes, we made an extra 10%. It's, you know, did you and your team get more joy, become more fulfilled, you know, those kinds of terms. And it's interesting when you use that as a way to communicate, the clients are much more interested than just talking about money. So
Yeah, 100%. And where does intrinsic motivation come from within organizations? You know, team members. And I think when they accomplish challenging things, they feel good about themselves. It elevates that. And I always really, shot for every employee will act like the CEO of their own role. They're running a business within a business. They know the numbers, what they have to do, where we're going. They can clearly describe how each leader, how they and their team creates value for the organization. And they can easily show you the best work that they're doing to continually increase the value for the organization. So I think that's where it comes from. It doesn't come from, hey, let's survey everybody to see if they're happy. And if they're not happy, what do we do? Oh, let's have a best friend at work program or something like that. No, that in my experience never works.
you know, you and I both have Vistage Tech in our backgrounds, and
Yeah.
I spoke a year or so ago over in Texas, and it was at a big specialty chemical manufacturer, and it was I can imagine I would have been in Able Aerospace when I was there, because they had us guided around by hourly people. And the hourly people were so knowledgeable about the business, and they understood why this was happening and the interrelationship between the silos that often are combative. And I left there going, wow, some people do figure this out. And in reading your book, it seemed like that was part of the mission, was to get your team engaged in almost everything that was going on.
Yeah, and when leadership is not intentional about how every team member and every team creates value within an organization, human nature just drives silos and all this other stuff that you're pointing to. And when you're super intentional about it, it drives human nature to cross-functionally collaborate, own the numbers, feel great about accomplishing challenging things. It's really not that hard to do. The challenge for most companies is that leadership is just not intentional about it.
Yeah. Um, and I love the word intentional. I use it all the time as well. Can you give us some examples of what intentional, the way you use it, means? I'm sure it's more than a business plan or a process. Could you talk a little bit about it from, how you lead in an intentional way?
Yeah, first and foremost, I believe philosophically that everything we do as an organization should be done at least with the intent of making things measurably better. And I say intent because we don't always get everything right. We make some mistakes, some decisions, and we're quite the right decisions. And so we want to be intentional about everything we do and design it to create value. And you can take culture as just one of those examples. Most would say, hey, culture is wildly important, and we have a mission, and we have values, and and yet they weren't intentional about driving it.
Yes.
When I ask folks inside organizations, Rick, and I know you see this too, hey, what's the mission? What are the values? Most have to look at a card to recite them. And I'm thinking to myself, well, who cares if you memorize it? How are you applying it to intentionally create more value? So, quick example there, if I use the, case study, one of my businesses, but I've done this with hundreds of companies now, and it's worked every single time. Before we develop an alignment to like a mission or set of behaviors or vision, we decide as a leadership team, how will having that make us measurably better as an organization? We have to have that conversation first, not just draft something that's a marketing slogan on a wall. And so at Able Aerospace, we said, you know what, or Able Engineering at the time, actually, we want a mission statement, and this was done in the late 90s, that tells our customers in a compelling way why they should do business with us. And at the same time, it tells every single team member why they get a paycheck, because if we don't create that value, our jobs are in jeopardy. We don't get a paycheck. And so the mission was to safely reduce aircraft operating costs by providing resourceful component repair, overhaul, and approved replacement parts solutions. I sold the company, and I stayed a little while to help it with a transition. It's been over 7 years now since I've been there. I'll never forget the mission. It was in my blood. Every 6 months, every employee would document one example of how they would apply the mission to make the organization measurably better. And they would take a shot at the ROI, or return on investment calculation they could. Same thing with behaviors. We had a set of values, got rid of those because all the different interpretations of what they meant. And I said, well, what are we trying to accomplish there? Well, we want to create the conditions where at any point in time, 80% or more of our team members are leading, performing, and behaving as good or better than the top 10% at our strongest, most admired competitors. Wouldn't that be amazing? Nobody would be able to touch us. And we surveyed all the employees. At the time, we were quite small, 70 employees, and 68 participated in the survey. And we got this giant list that distilled down to 6 behaviors that stood the test of time. Back then we said high performing team members at Able Engineering do what they say they will. They have a personal commitment to the end result. They're respectful, honest, and straightforward. They treat company resources as their own. They're fully engaged and participate within the team. I'll never forget these. The quality policy, the vision, all of it, because we intentionally designed that stuff in a way that we believed would create more value for the organization. And we actually got those right, because, before selling, we had, 15 years straight of, 20% compounded annual growth on average, had a really nice exit, and they continue to be wildly successful. It worked. And every core product we chose to focus on, there wasn't a competitor on the planet that could beat us. So it worked. Yay.
Yeah. Um, I'm just kind of marveling because you make it, and that was one of the things I loved about the book. You make it so obvious and so simple, yet so few people do it. Why do you think it's so few people do it?
They don't understand the value of it. That's a really big question, right? So if you're walking along and there's $100 bill laying on the ground and you can pick it up, there's no recourse for taking it. You can spend it, do whatever. If you don't see the value and it just looks like a, piece of trash on the ground, you're not going to grab it. I don't think they see the value, even though they'll say, oh, there's lots of value in culture and getting it right. They haven't really gone to the front lines and experimented with it to see what works and doesn't work. So they don't see the value, not enough to actually do it. So what I've seen is talking about stuff like strategy and culture. Everybody loves to do that. And that's 3% of the game. 97%, like I talk about in my book, is actually being on the front lines and executing and doing it. What works, what doesn't work. It's really a quite simple, elegant structure to put in place, but it does take a little bit of work to get there. And leaders have to come in every single day and make sure they're reinforcing that stuff and guiding their teams to create more and more value over time.
As I read your book, and I don't know if I was putting my own wishful thinking in it, but I believe that people are our greatest opportunity to leverage our business. And as I listened to your talking about the intentionality and the fact that everybody knew what value was, my sense was you were growing the business as much out of the people individually getting better as a team, and being more collaborative and more creative or inventive. Or was that true, or was I just kind of optimistically reading into the?
Well, the people are everything. Without the people, you don't have a business. The leadership all the way to the frontline team members. So, 100% agree with you on that. Now, how most companies think about, or organizations think about, their people and setting them up for success, I think that's where the challenge is. Even though people are by far the most important, they're the third piece in how I design the value that we're going to create. The first piece is the outcomes. What are the outcomes we want to achieve? Okay. And then second, what's the ideal structure to achieve the outcome? So it's functions, it's locations, it's allocation of resources. Within the structure, there are roles, and every role should have 2 to no more than 4 outcome-based responsibilities that are measurable, with a list of maybe 10 to 30 capabilities that person filling a role would have to be able to achieve the outcomes. Now I look at the people and say, okay, who do I have that has the capabilities that's right for each one of those roles? Now we've truly set them up for success. Whereas you hear all the, again, business maxims, just get the right people on the bus and all the most amazing things happen. Well, maybe, it's never, again, one business or leadership maxim that causes the current conditions to happen, good, bad, or indifferent. And so that's how I think about it. I want them all to win. We have to develop them. And early on, as a startup, entrepreneur, I did almost all the jobs. And then I got really intentional about giving earned sort of autonomy and decision rights away once people would actually get there. And working 80 hours a week was normal, but I loved it. I mean, it never really felt like work. It was challenging. But towards the end, I didn't have to spend 15 hours a week actually doing the nuts and bolts of running the business. The rest of the time I spent developing team members.
Now, I'd love to hear, as I read, I kept thinking about what's the process you use to recruit and onboard and train, and because it sounded like a lot of succession planning at every level. How did you approach all that?
Yeah, there's succession planning and there's backup planning, because I think In most organizations, in terms of pure numbers, backup is more challenging than the succession piece. And all roles do not create equal value. You know, as the companies get bigger, the senior leaders at the top can make or break an organization and the value they create more than one individual frontline team member, typically. So in thinking about this whole process, we would, and we started this back in Able Engineering, we would look at a role, and it could be a machinist or a mechanic or an inspector or a leader, and we would say, you know, how many people could fill in for that person if they called in sick that day? And if there were 2 or 3 people that could do it, we ranked it green, great. If there was nobody that could do it without supervision, but we could kind of get it done, it was yellow. And if there was no one, it was red. And so every position that was red, we scrambled to do cross training to make sure that there was 1 or more people that could step into that role and actually do it. And so that was wildly helpful, kind of going through that exercise. And everybody had to do it. It wasn't that hard. It was just how we thought about it. And then the onboarding process, most will post for a job, and here's a job description. It's just like a list of things you could do. It's like, no, it's great company, great leaders. Here's the role we're looking to fill. These are the 2 to 4 outcome-based responsibilities that you will have to achieve. And here's the list of capabilities we found people need to be able to achieve those outcomes. And now we're filtering for that. We're also filtering for culture. Here's our mission. This is the value we create in the world. Here are the behaviors. This is how we agree to interact with each other. So you're recruiting for a role and delivering on outcomes and a cultural fit inside the organization. And all of your training in every stage of the process should match that. Ask me what percentage of time I see companies that actually do that. Well, almost 100% of the time with the companies that we have worked with, but 0 for the companies we haven't worked with.
Yeah. If I understood, you help the potential employee triage themselves in or out of a job instead of you having to do it, because you make it so clear what they're going to be accountable for and, you know, what their team's going to expect from them. That I'm guessing there are some people who say, no, that's not me. Is that accurate?
That's completely accurate. So you are setting them up and the company up for success a much higher percentage of the time. And even those that will get through the filters and have to eventually be let go because they're not performing, when you're clear like this, you'll save 6 to 8 of them into solid middle performers. And then the other thing that it does is when you do have to let someone go and you've got this role and here's 2 or 3 outcome-based responsibilities, and you have the initial conversation and say, this is why we're investing in you. We're going to keep our bargain 100% of the time and pay you everything we agree to pay you. And here's the expected result. And they buy into it. Yep, I should be able to do that. Okay. Also, if those results fall below this line, then this won't work. Do you understand that? Because this has to happen. It's critical for the company. In my opinion, every role is critical. They're all playing a part, or why would we have it? And oh yeah, I totally get that. So when it does fall below the line and you have that conversation, it's a pretty easy conversation. I would say 19 out of 20 of those conversations I've had have gone really well. Yep, you're absolutely right. I thought I could do it and I wasn't able to. And then we would preserve their dignity, help them find another job. And usually 1 out of 20 times they would say, but don't you think I bring value? And they would try to, bring some moral weaponry to, say you're a bad person if you fire somebody. It's like, no, we had an agreement. This isn't personal. The company needs this particular outcome. You were hired to get it. I really appreciate you trying. Let me help you find another job. So it makes all of it easier. It's easier to be more successful recruiting, and a lot easier when, unfortunately, sometimes you have to let people go. And those shouldn't be tense conversations. It should just be, hey, we had a deal that didn't work out. You're a great person. This is awesome. And there's always a role somewhere that's right for just about everybody in my experience. Yeah.
Boy, I could do this all day with you. do you use any, have you used any of the assessments people use to indicate motivation or aptitude or any of that type of thing for your hiring?
Uh, yes, I've been through probably most of them. What it came down to for me is just understanding where somebody comes from. It's good to know that. And the tool that I thought worked the best, actually by far, was called Personalysis. And it would show your, rational self, social self, and instinctual self. And once you understood motivations, it was truly helpful in relating to others and valuing others even more. I totally get that. I mean, it's an amazing tool, but that in itself won't make a company
Right.
successful without all the foundational stuff that you and I are just starting to talk about. Those tools won't matter, in my
Yeah.
experience.
Then one of the other things you said a minute ago, and I didn't capture your exact language, but you were referring to people who come to work, do what they're supposed to, create the outcomes, deliver the value, but they weren't necessarily what superstars or a player type scenario. Was that part of how to build a great team?
Well, I wanted an operating methodology to where 80% of, teams, that was my goal. It's actually over 90% in how it's working, can perform really well, create great value, even when a superstar isn't in the room, because a lot of folks take the easy route, which is still kind of the hard route. They think, and they hire the best leaders they can and hope for the best. And rather than one intentional way of creating value that permeates throughout the organization, if you have 10 leaders or 100 leaders, you have 10 to 100 slightly to significantly different ways of creating value. And so, when something isn't working out, let's just replace the leader. But when you have an operating methodology everybody agrees to, it just makes it easier for everyone to create value. Oh, and by the way, we're being intentional about the value we'd like them to create. We're being clear. We're not just bringing them in and hoping for the best. So again, not very hard to do. You said it earlier, Rick, and it's wild to me that more organizations won't be clear about the value they want everybody to create, and then tie all of that value creation together.
Yeah. Now, one of the other terms you've used, and it sounds absolutely perfect, but I'm guessing it is interpreted differently, and that's the capabilities. How did you define capabilities so that, everybody on your team knew what those were? Because it sounds like that's an important measurement.
Well, there's capability as an organization, and then there's capability for a team member that's filling a particular role. So as an organization, hey, we were capable of overhauling, certain types of helicopters and lots of different assemblies off fixed wing and rotor wing aircraft for many platforms. Now, on the individual level for a role, if I just, take a machinist, you are capable of running this model of lathe and all of these things in there. If you're an accountant, you're capable of reconciling the books and it's accurate. And, part of your outcomes could be timely delivery of accurate information. But if you're not capable of putting all the numbers in and reconciling and making sure that it's accurate, you can't do the others. So it's really quite simple. I haven't met a role yet, even though I've been told by many people, oh, we're just different and you can't measure it. 100% of the time, you actually can find some outcome that's measurable, that makes sense, that really captures the value that you're trying to get from this role inside an organization. But it's never more than 2 to 4. Sometimes it's only 1. But there's a big list of often capabilities you have to be able to get it. And the challenge can come where, hey, we just let so-and-so be the marketing manager because they're interested in marketing. And then we set a strategy. They're left to implement the strategy. Well, it didn't work. They come back and say, that didn't work. Well, that's probably not the case. The strategy was probably right. They didn't have the capability to execute on it, but their crutch is, oh yeah, we talked about that. That didn't work. Well, you didn't do the right work to make it work.
Yeah.
So it's organizational capability, individual capability by role.
And that sounds like it aligns with your intentional, that you have to know the intentions of the outcomes to define the capabilities, so that the person knows what they're expected to do.
Absolutely. If I'm going to deliver this result, well, what would I need to know? Where would I need to be capable to have a really good chance at delivering on that result?
Interesting. Interesting.
Hmm.
Um, you know, as you look into the future, do you see, you must have had every generation working for you, and from boomers to generation Z or X or whatever the youngest is. Did this have any different impact in one generation to another?
I found that it didn't. I think this value creation struggle cycle that I've been talking about in a lot of different ways here today is timeless. And I remember commenting to one of the experts on this, and I forget the gentleman's name, but he'd written lots of papers on the different generations and
Yeah.
how to think about them, and you have to approach them completely different. And I said, sometimes it can take me, but not always, but up to 6 months to get some of these younger folks on the program and creating value. And he looks at me and says, "Well, you need to write a book because almost nobody's doing that." But all I did was put in an intentional way of creating value, and it's actually a lot of fun. When you accomplish challenging things, it is a blast. It's fulfilling,
Yes.
self-esteem.
Yes.
It's so great. And who doesn't who doesn't like that? Who doesn't want to feel valued and heard and part of a team? They all do, in my experience. I mean, with very, very, very few exceptions. Some people are fairly broken, but you can get through to those too. And I love those challenges.
Yeah. And the individual fulfillment is something that, I look at my friends who work their whole lives just so they could get out of their job and retire.
Mhm.
And, they work 30 years or 40 years unfulfilled in their work, and, just for the money of it. And I hope that doesn't happen to anybody else again, because there's so many opportunities to do things that need to be done that
Mm.
could be fulfilling if we, design it correct. The intentionality again, we make the intentionality right. Um, so I'm thrilled to hear that it didn't have a generational thing, because certainly that's my experience as well. If you're doing something meaningful, important, and you give people a chance to, put their own spin on it and effort and get rewarded for achieving what they set out to do, I think everybody likes that, or almost everybody.
They do, even when they say they don't. Deep down inside, I find that they actually do. And what you pointed to is mindset, and it's everything. How you think about it, and if I'm just slogging through to get to this next step, in a career and money, so I can retire, that's a mindset that's not very healthy. And everything we do, in my view, should be through the lens of how will this create value in the world in a win-win way. And again, material, emotional, energy, and spiritual. And spirituals can be, wildly
Yeah.
different for everyone. Connectedness, if you feel love for others, that's part of
Yeah.
spirituality. But how do you play in there, and where do you create value? And if you make your identity, as a kid, a star football player, and you get injured and you can't play, and it could completely crush you. But if your identity is creating emotional value in the world, you just shift it a little bit
Yep.
and do something. Oh, that was one avenue. Now you've got another avenue. You could pick up, music or something, or writing or whatever, along those lines. But being super intentional about mindset, I think, is wildly important too. So I'm glad you kind of pointed that direction, right?
And do you have historical turnover data of your staff? And do you have any idea how that compares with other places?
Yeah, one thing I thought was really fascinating is I had never had a leader quit. And we've had to ask a few to leave, at the aerospace business, had to ask a few to leave because, we'd outgrown them, or, they violated one of our behaviors or other alignment tools. The only one that did leave, of all of them, it wasn't quitting. He told me when he started, when I get an opening, or when there's an opening at the FAA to be a principal maintenance inspector, that's my dream job. I think it was like 2.5, 3 years after he started, he got the opportunity, and I thanked him for his time with us. But never had another leader quit, which says a lot. But turnover would be high or low depending on what was going on. If team members weren't achieving the outcome-based responsibilities for the role below a certain point, well, we had to make a change. And some years it could be a little bit higher, other years lower. But on average, I think our turnover was lower than others in our space that were our size. When I sold it, we had a little over 500 employees.
Now, I'm imagining that you were in businesses with a lot of technology and a lot of volatility in everything to do with it. Did you find people moving from one role in the company to another based on their capabilities of doing other jobs?
Well, there was some of that, and we were really big on cross-functional training because we weren't a production shop. Everything was special handling. Imagine an emergency room for aircraft parts. It shows up, you triage it. It could go literally 1,000 parts in all different directions and come back together within 28 days and go back to the customer in a safe fashion so they could meet their mission, for the aircraft. And the work fluctuated wildly, and so there's no way we could staff every single team cell with the manpower to keep up with the peak. So that's how we dealt with it. And so there were a lot of folks that could do a lot of different things, including me. I started with the company. I could do virtually every job in the company, and I loved it.
Yeah. So, like I say, I could talk to you all day long, but what advice do you have for first new people coming into their careers? They're in the first 5 years, they're trying to figure out where they want to go. And then the same kind of question, what advice do you have for leaders to try and lead today in today's shortage of people and the fact that the pandemic kind of encouraged us that life's too short to be doing really dumb stuff. So what advice do you have for those two groups?
Yeah, I would say for the first one, just think about creating value in the world, right? How do you create value for yourself, the communities you engage with, your family, the organization you're going to work for, you're just starting with? And it's not just dollars, right? Again, it's material, which includes that, but it's the emotional and spiritual energy. So think about that. How do we increase that value in those three buckets? And then on the other side, what is your definition of what it means to be a leader in the organization that you're working for? And the simplest definition that I like to apply, and you can take it out and make it as big as you want, but leaders get results and they foster an environment where every team member is intrinsically motivated to create more value over time. That's your job. Get results, and you want more and more of it actually coming from the team. And yes, it's hard to find people, but if you truly are a best place to work, not win an award because you paid money at a little conference and all the plaques and everything else. I never bought into any of that. We actually truly were, on the aerospace side, a best place to work. And we had people where there was lots of available talent, but no available talent. There was always a waiting list to come into the company because our team members would tell two friends about what a great place it is to work. So that's my probably best, very short advice I could give around those two groups.
Wow, very cool. Very cool. And I love to hear both of those because in the research I've done, it's that those abilities to pass value other than just can I know how to run a NC machine or something like that, and how can I make the team better, and how can I put my brain into making the process better for the client and for my team members, and then as a leader creating that place where people want to get up in the morning and come in and, be part of it is, it's too rare today. So, well, this has been spectacular. And I guess I'd like to ask just what's the one thing you'd like to leave us with? Because you have so many lessons that you're teaching people. What's the one thing you'd like to have us all think about from what you've before that? I said I was going to make sure you talked a little bit about the software company and the consulting company. So to share a little bit about that before I ask you what's the last thing you'd like to leave us with?
Yeah, sure. My current business, where I spend most of my time, is called Execute to Win, or ETW, and you can learn about it just by going to etw.com. And there's you can find my book there, but you can also find my book in 40,000 channels anywhere a book is sold. The audio book, I do 30-minute interviews approximately after each chapter for more insights and background in there. And we help organizations implement the MIND methodology, which stands for most important number in drivers. And you can learn all about that in my book, Your Most Important Number. And it's really just a very simple, elegant, intentional, and very powerful way of creating value within any organization. And then something else that we do is that we run, and I have my own personal groups, CEO mastermind groups. We call them Execute. And we use the MIND methodology in these groups, and the results are spectacular. If you're a CEO that is in a real growth mindset, and it's not just growth in terms of dollars and people, it's growth in value of the organization. These are amazing groups for you to be part of. I'm even starting another group in Q1 of 24 that I'm personally going to run, but we have certified chairs that are building their groups out there too. And you can learn about all of that just by going to etw.com.
Great. And I just can't say enough about the book. And I think it makes your intentionality real, because people say, well, I'm intentional, but you give us a whole new way to think about that in the real world, and not just personally, but as a team and as a member of a team. And I think that's highly valuable. So what's the last thing you'd like to leave us with?
If there's one most important thing to get out of this interview, and I think it's the reason, it's really more of a conversation, not an interview, and I've really enjoyed it. The reason that listeners should listen to this is thinking about creating value differently and finding, sort of finding, why are you even here? My whole purpose for being on this planet is to promote this concept of value creation. And if you think about it that way, it's so much easier. I mean, imagine going to work every day and solving problems, or going to work every day to create value. It feels and is so much different. So I'll leave you with that, and I hope your listeners get a ton of value out of this, Rick.
It's interesting that starting a couple of years ago, when I would do a talk for Vistage or in Canada Tech, I started asking CEOs, how often in a week do you intentionally, use your intentional word, think about the value you're going to transfer to your ideal buyer that they'll pay you for? And when I ask that question, I get very blank looks. And most of the time, the answer is, I don't ever do that. And I find that fascinating. If the CEO's not thinking about how does my organization transfer more value, I can't imagine what the people on the team are thinking about.
And Rick, that's so powerful, because all they have to do is just start intentionally thinking about it, make a few little changes, and a pretty disproportionately larger improvement in the bottom line will happen almost all the time when they haven't been thinking about it.
Yeah, and it's a metric I try to give all the clients now is, have your if you're working with people who have a calendar, on the calendar, whenever you do that in the week, or schedule it, to do it at least once a day, or somehow make this part of your culture. And I get very strange looks. hopefully I can.
I hope you encourage them to read my book, because that's how you can actually do it. And the ultimate goal is to connect culture to value creation. That's it.
Amen.
Yeah.
Amen. Amen. So, well, Lee, this has been terrific. I really appreciate it. And thank you for joining me today.
My pleasure, Rick. Thank you.
And for those of you watching, hope you enjoyed this as much as I did. And I'll see you in a couple of weeks for the next one.